Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
Hi, welcome to another edition of What's This Show For? FOR, Friends of Ron. I'm your host, Ron Levitsky. There's an old saying that you have to teach a child to hate. And that's probably true. The corollary to that is that once a child hates, can you teach that child to love? And in fact, you can. And we're going to see that today with a very remarkable guest, Pastor John Alan Boryk. Pastor Boryk, John, great to have you with us.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
And we met at a Deerfield Rotary where you spoke, and I was in the audience, and I was so impressed that I asked you to come on the show, and you were kind enough to agree. It's a remarkable story that involves an iconic figure of the 20th century, and a young theological student.
Yes.
Kind of brought together by unusual circumstances. So let's start by going back, as I often do, and can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, your background?
Yes, I was raised in the South. I grew up in several southern states. All the schools were segregated. When I questioned that, people would say, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way it is. Don't mess with it. Don't change it. And in high school, it was a mystery why the South lost what we call the War of Northern Aggression. I mean, and it's still taught. That's really the only war in some parts of the state, of the South. All the others are not important.
I had a friend who was from here, and he went down to a school in Kentucky and took a history class, American history, and he said, I took a Civil War class, and up to the last week, the South was winning.
Yes,
and all of a sudden, we found out they lost.
And the generals were heroes. I know that came later with the statues, and that's been in the news recently, but that's a very important event, and still is today.
Now, when we had our discussion before the show, preparing for the show, you used the phrase that back then people knew their place. What did you mean by that?
Yes, and the place was decided by color. I can remember I was only 4 or 5 years old, and a colleague or friend, peer, a little older, said, John Allen, no matter how bad you are or how low you get or how broke, you are always better than, and he used the N word. And that's the place. And in some places of the South, housing is mixed, more mixed than in Chicago, say. But people knew their place. And you had to preserve that way of life.
So when you went to elementary and high school in the South, what was the experience like in terms of race?
Yes, it wasn't talked about much, but I lived closer in one town to the black school than I did the white school. And I recall in high school taking over some old science equipment to Dunbar High School in Oklahoma, and was appalled at the conditions. We were giving them used textbooks that were outdated, technically, and their lab was just nothing. There was no equipment, and it was disturbing to me even then. But that's the way it is. That's the way it is.
And so the schools were segregated.
Absolutely.
And I was surprised you told me that when you lived in Mississippi, Kosciuszko, that you're a bit older, like I am, of a very, very, very famous celebrity now who went to a black school there.
Yes, she did, and that was Oprah Winfrey. And she has a school there, built a school, an elementary school when she was there. the schools were, the population so small that had there been integrated schools, we would have been in the same school. And there would be people in that town of Kosciuszko, it's a little north of Jackson, who would have met her and been in school with her. But look what they lost, what they didn't have. White privilege in reverse, or, you know, it was deprived of that opportunity.
For those of us who are a little younger and may not have seen this, and those of us who are older and all too well know these images, let's take a look at a couple of slides that John's provided about what it was like in the segregated South, just in terms of the signage.
I remember in the train station, there were 4 bathrooms, 4 restrooms, colored on one side and white on the other. And that was typical of public spaces like bus stations and transportation.
Okay, next, please.
This was on the public buses, and there was a line in the back of the bus, and if more white people came on, people of color had to stand up and let white people, you know, sit back there. I remember one day sitting back there to see what it was like. It was kind of bouncy, but that was just a kid riding the bus. Popular sign.
And of course that led to the Montgomery bus
Yes,
boycott.
yeah, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery boycott because of that actual fact. Women who had worked all day, sitting there, and a white man come up and say, "I have to take your place," and people sometimes would even be arrested or taken forcibly off the bus.
Wow. Next one, please.
Yes, in Ardmore, Oklahoma, where I grew up, one of the towns, there was a public swimming pool, and the white leaders that had means built a new pool for people of color. So rather than have people go to the same swimming pool, they had a separate one, and that was a way to prevent that. It was called mixed bathing. Just didn't do that.
Okay.
Now that's not the case.
All right, and the last one of this group?
Yes, water fountains. One was white, one colored. I remember when I was about 9, I went to like a Kresge store, and I was curious. I looked around, no one was looking, and I thought Kool-Aid would come out. I mean, that's how silly this was. And I have a story that I could tell about being in Kosciuszko, Mississippi, in a building that had not been occupied. We were high school building our homecoming float, and it was still quite warm. And I remember going upstairs or into the waiting area, the front room, and going to a water fountain, brand new water fountain, and taking a drink of water, and my classmates laughing. They laughed because someone had taken a piece of notebook paper and scotch taped it to the top of it and said colored. Ridiculous. 2 brand new water fountains.
Yeah.
But that was the way it was.
Now, you studied theology.
Yes.
And it always kind of confused me that there could be segregation and that church or religion would support that. So when you were taking in church or going to religious studies, what was the take on segregation?
Yes, that was a hard one because my feelings had to do with attitudes and prejudices that I had learned growing up. I remember writing in my Bible one time, to discriminate against God, people is to discriminate against God. And yet I had in my hand the 25 biblical reasons for segregation. And that's still, I think there's still people in the South, maybe in Alabama today, who still believe that.
Do you remember any of them?
No, I really can't. I'm glad I don't remember them. But a phrase would say, "You don't see red birds and bluebirds." You know, that kind of conversation would go around. And said it wasn't God's plan that way.
Now you left the South to go to college in the North, in Illinois, in fact.
Yes,
How did that happen?
It's a mystery. I had a scholarship to the University of Oklahoma, had housing, had a job. But something kept gnawing at me to go to a different place. And so I went to Aurora, which is now Aurora University, which was a church-related school at that time, and had never been there, had never been up here. But I know that was a major difference in how I turned out, because I could have stayed in that school and just used bigger words to talk about segregation.
Yeah, you told me that when you went back, you see your old friends, and they'd gone to college and they just became, you said, they just became more sophisticated bigots.
They did. That's what they did. And we couldn't even talk about that.
So did you come in contact with people of color?
Well, at school, yes, of course. And in fact, my roommate, when I met him, he wasn't my color. And I wasn't going to make a fool of myself. So I said, Ralph, are you a Negro? And Ralph just laughed. Ralph Premdas was from then British Guiana. And he said, no, he said, my people are from India, because that was a British colony, and his family were that. So that was a wake-up call for my feelings. And then we had a class, mandatory class with assigned seating, and I was seated to sit next to one of the darkest people I've ever seen, that close. And I didn't know what to do, because if I sat next to her, I would be breaking the code. And again, I didn't want to make a fool of myself as a freshman in this school, so I sat next to her, and I regret not talking to her. I wrote her a letter a few years back and didn't get an answer, and found out that she had died. And I was nice to her. I was polite. I didn't use the N-word. I didn't do that. But she probably sensed my feelings.
And the theology you studied, I mean, did it deal with race?
Well, it would, but that was my head. I could say that, but could I date a woman of color? Because of the attitudes, the feelings that are down deep, it can't be turned off just because you hear a new idea. Okay. Something has to happen.
And speaking of that, so one day, one of your teachers invites you somewhere.
Yes.
And when was this?
This would be March of 1965, and the date would be the 14th. And what had happened prior to that was Bloody Sunday. And I think you have a picture of that, maybe, or no?
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
So let's wait on that. But
sure.
Go ahead.
But to put it into context, what I had seen of Martin Luther King was a riot. It'd be just a clip, 2 minutes, and he seemed angry, and it seemed like that's what. So wherever he went, there would be violence and a riot. And so I was invited to come in to hear him speak in Chicago. And I said, man, I know what he's going to say. You know, he'll say this and that, and I have no interest in that. But they prevailed upon me and said, well, come on and just see. Come and see. So I went.
And let's see the program. John has kept the program ever since. Okay, so Chicago Sunday Evening Club. It
was a lay-run, mainly Protestant, every Sunday evening, and then have national speakers come. And so I went to that. The Wheaton Glee Club sang. There was religious music. And when King spoke, he preached a sermon. He didn't talk about Selma, didn't talk about the Voting Rights Act, didn't talk about any of that. He talked about a God that loves us to the heights and depths and east and west, all of that. And during that sermon, it was like a volcano of hate just kind of erupted. And it was a traumatic experience. It was beyond my intellect. It had to do with my heart. And after he spoke, my friend Ted Jones, who's also a retired pastor, went back and
when you said, excuse me, but you said a volcano of hate.
Well,
was it hate towards King?
No, it was all of that crap I've been taught all my life. Had nothing to do with King, because his words really melted that and changed that.
So it was like a cleansing sort
It was like a cleansing, a cathartic experience, if you will. And it was emotional.
Was it, you know, he was known for being such a wonderful orator. Was it the words or the way he said it, or both?
I think it was a combination. His spirit, he was just very charismatic. And he had this melodious baritone voice. But he was steeped in Scripture. He was a Baptist preacher. He had a PhD from school and was sought after. But he went back to the South, and he used those skills and those gifts, as well as his theology to bear on change that had to take place. But he was there to preach a sermon, not to do a rally. And that's what sneaked in. I was prepared to argue with him, but instead his words just changed my heart.
Okay, and so then you had a really incredible opportunity right after that.
Yes, I did, Ron. Afterwards, Ted and I went back, and no one was around, but here was Dr. King standing by himself. And I went up to him, and then my southern coloration said, Dr. King, said, I don't know what happened to me. Things have just changed. And he put his hand on my shoulder. He was the same height as me. He was not a tall person. And he said, you'll be all right, and I'll pray for you. And that has sustained me, that comment, that experience through all these years as I continue to use that story and to help people my color to come to grips with white privilege.
And we'll talk about white privilege later. On the ride, do you remember on the ride home what it was like? Did you say anything, or were you just overwhelmed?
It was a blur. There were some conversations. I didn't talk about what had happened to me so much. I remember being in the car and being quiet. But what I do remember is I didn't sleep that night. All of that culture clashing with a love that's unconditional. And I recall a day or two later when Dr. King and Southern Christian Leadership Conference were asking people from the north, college students, to come down to Selma the following week.
Okay, before we get to that, so how did this change your relationship, if it did, with family and friends back home?
Interesting, Ron. That's really interesting. The school required us to get parental permission if we were to go to Selma.
And we have to let the audience understand, might remind them that when we talk about the Selma March, it's actually Selma Marches, right? There were three?
At least three.
Okay, so
could be four.
So there had been the violent march, and we'll see a picture of that in a moment. And so you were going to ask your folks if you could go down.
Yes. Okay. And the news, we didn't, college kids don't pay that much attention to national news, at least when I was there. You knew about it. You'd watch a little television, maybe in newspapers. But we knew that Reverend James Reeb had been killed. So I called home, and my mother answered the phone. And she said, well, yes, of course. And she also said, but it's a good thing your dad didn't answer the phone, because he would have said no.
Now, why do you think she gave you permission so quickly?
I could brag about my mother, who was a very balanced person. She was a teacher, and she'd always say that there's two sides to things. So before you jump on one, which was different from a lot of the adults when I grew up, there was only one way. But she would say, well, we ought to look at this a little differently. There may be another side to this. She had a larger heart than I think my dad at that time did.
I just think it's incredible that a parent would back their child realizing the stigma within their own society that was going to bring.
Well,
I'm sure she got a lot of blowback from neighbors and friends.
Exactly. And my friend Ted, his father said, no, you cannot go. There were only 4 of us that went on that trip. And several wanted to go, but parents would say no. That's a dangerous place. You could get hurt.
Yeah, and your dad, though, eventually, did he come around?
Yes, he did. And that's much later. I would go home after the march, and I would, he'd talk, he was surprised, why did I go? And we would talk for hours around the breakfast table about these ideas. And I would go back the next summer for a visit, and we would still clash. But one year, probably 5 years later, maybe more, I went back, and he had had an experience with a person of color, African American, that was helpful to him. And he put his arms around me and said, John Alan, I'm glad you represented our family at Selma.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, touch my,
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, that was.
Let's take a look at the next picture, which is a photograph that people again our age would unfortunately remember the first Bloody March, where on a Sunday police beat nonviolent marchers who wanted to go from Selma to the Capitol.
Yes, and this was the state police, not the local police.
Yeah.
They were for King. And I think that person in the foreground is John Lewis. We have a picture of him.
Yeah, can we go to the next picture of, this was...
That's the crowd in front of Brown's Chapel on Sylvan Street. Now it's Martin Luther King Street. And the church is still there. People gathered from all faiths, different religions, agnostics and religious. You can see the Roman Catholic nuns there, hippies and everything in between, black and white, and all people gathering to go. This is the march to Selma. That early one was the march on March 7th, and this is March 21.
Okay, the next picture, please.
This is a little out of order, but this is going across the bridge on March 7th.
Okay.
John Lewis, who's now Congressman John Lewis, was leading the march, and the earlier picture showed where he was beaten. In fact, he cracked his skull, and there's an X-ray in Selma in a museum of his cracked skull.
Aye.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hold off on any more pictures. Let's talk a little bit about, kind of jumping forward. You had a distinguished career in theology. When you came back from Selma and you started to get involved in religion and as a occupation, did people know about your participation in the Selma March, and how did they react?
Oh, exactly. I felt before Selma, before meeting Dr. King, I always felt like I was less than other people, in that the people from New England or from California, they said there's no difference, you know. I saw color, and I felt differently. I still did. Even with the religious training, I'm a good person. I was traveling into Chicago in a black church, teaching Sunday school class. I'm doing all these things, trying to deal with something that wasn't quite right. But when I came back from Selma, they said, oh, you went too far. Like, you're radical now. I didn't feel like I was a radical. I felt normal. I felt liberated. I felt like I was a person who could be more than I thought I could be. And I had a job that summer working in church camps as a college representative. And two of them said, you can't come because we're neutral on this issue. I mean, how ridiculous. I went anyway and met a lot of wonderful people.
Wow. And I was fascinated because today you still have worked on issues of race and understanding. And one of the things you deal with, which I find fascinating, is the concept of white privilege, which many white people don't understand. And then, there's your contact information if people want to contact you. Tell us about how you would define white privilege, and what are some examples that we take for granted?
Sure. You can Google white privilege and find a lot of examples, Ron. But people who are our color, I don't think can ever understand what it's like to be a person of color. I think it's impossible, quite frankly. And I think we have to acknowledge color exists, and to accept the fact that just because of our color, we are seldom stopped for a broken tail light. We are not followed around in a store like people have been. We can get into most any school we'd like to get into. We can live almost anywhere we want to live. And this is not that we're mean and nasty, it's just that we've enjoyed that and not realized it. I've taught a class and say, what are the characteristics of an African American, a person of China, and what of white? And the word is normal. I mean, that's what even though whites are a minority in the globe, we think that what we do, and we don't think about it. We need to look at how privileged we are, so we can listen to people of color, that black lives matter, not just white lives. And it takes some work, because we've inherited this. Nothing we did, we're just born this color. But to study that, to see the movie Selma, or see the movie The Help, the one about NASA, Numbers.
Oh, the ladies.
Yes,
Yeah.
To see that history has been dropped out of our books. We don't know that, and to see the greatness of what the contributions that have been made.
Yeah. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement. Some people, many white people would say, well, sure, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. But what do you think people who use the phrase Black Lives Matter mean by that?
Yes. Just looking at some of the actions by a minority of police officers, people in power, and the way that they will disarm or shoot a person of color, it only takes a couple of bullets, but why 16? Why shoot the person in the back? It's because, in fact, I remember in Mississippi, a man talking to me about a friend of his who had a worker who was a person of color. And he said him and his N-word went over to see somebody. It was like Ron and his dog took a little walk. And that's what was being taught, and it's caught in subtle ways. And people of color, it doesn't matter how famous they are, it doesn't matter how wealthy they are, people who are white will sometimes think they are better than. That's not true everywhere, but to treat people who are different as worthy. Our blood is all the same color.
As you look from the vantage point of 2017, almost 2018, versus 1965, are you encouraged by what's gone on in terms of race relations? Are you disappointed? Are you impatient? Mm-hmm. What's your feeling looking back?
A lot of good things have happened, but people today, younger people, have not lived through some of those. Racism is still alive and well, and it needs to be addressed. And I'm disappointed we haven't moved faster. Just because we had a president who was a person of color does not mean we were through. It only means that there were some intelligent people voting for a very capable person to be president. I suggest to people, everybody says, oh, I have a black friend. Well, do they come over to your house for Thanksgiving or to watch a ball game? If you have people of color, and maybe they'll take the time to help you with your guilt or your prejudices. Just say, what's it like? And some that will trust you will say that. And it's painful for them. And it needs to be painful for us, because if we experience that, we're more likely to do something about it. We have contact with city officials, you and I do, and people like us. And we can call our state senator or representative. We know their name. We've been down there. We know our Congress people. And we have access to that. And to say, here's a part of society that has not been treated as fairly as it needs to be. There's much work to be done. Much work to be done.
It sounds like what you're saying is that a lot of it is going to be accomplished by one-on-one contact, by interpersonal relationships.
I think that's been true with LGBTQ situations, people who were homophobic, by meeting and visiting and sensing the spirit of a person whose sexual orientation is different. I think it's true with this as well. Yeah. It's true with race as well.
Any last words? Because we're just about out of time.
Well, thank you for letting me come, Ron.
My pleasure.
It's a wonderful story. It's not my story. It's a story that happened to me, and I'm glad to share it in hopes that people, I call myself a recovering racist. Everybody else has to determine where they are. I think there's a lot to be done, and I'm glad to have this privilege of sharing this information.
Well, thank you so much, Pastor John Alan Boryk, for sharing your story. It's so inspiring. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I look forward to seeing you next time on What's This Show For, FOR, Friends of Ron. Once again, I'm your host, Ron Levitsky. Bye-bye.